Hello, everyone. My name is Louis Ong from Sunway International Business Society. We have a very special guest today with us, Mr. Melvin Poh. Mr. Melvin, as the founder of Empirics Asia, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Melvin Poh. I'm the founder of Empirics. We are a knowledge crowdsourcing platform that is currently trying to do something quite ambitious. We're trying to gather all the collective knowledge of Asia through all social scientific fields in one central site. And we want to facilitate everyone's access to this platform. So anyone could technically contribute and access it entirely free of charge. So it's an open access platform. And so to date, I think we have published just over 1 million articles, and it's growing exponentially, at least over the past 8 years of our operation.
Great. Thank you very much for introducing yourself. We were known that Empirics Asia was formerly known as the Asian Entrepreneur. So what was the significance of the company's rebranding?
Right. So the reason why we rebranded is because we saw what we were doing was quite successful, at least in the sense of offering a very different sort of approach to actually publishing content. The way we're doing it, of course, for most people, they understand it, is actually crowd publishing. So we have a model where we entirely allow people to participate in the editorial process. So we saw the result was quite good in terms of actually producing content that is very relevant and also impactful for business. But then that was also its sort of shortfall, because we were only focusing on business. So the idea always carried with me, what if we were to apply this to a wider context, not just business, but potentially other fields, maybe, for example, sociology, philosophy, psychology. So it was always this idea that was deep inside me. And then eventually, after quite a few years, we finally decided to do it after we raised investments for it. So that was really it. It is a grand ambition, certainly, because again, introducing more fields would mean more things for us to do. But again, we are up for the task and we're doing it very passionately.
Thank you, Mr. Melvin. We'll proceed to the next question. Empirics Asia has been compared with other open access knowledge platforms such as Wikipedia and Investopedia. May I know how Empirics Asia differentiate themselves from these open access knowledge platforms?
So at the outset, I have to say, we will not deny absolutely that we are largely inspired by some of the platforms you just mentioned, especially Wikipedia. In my personal opinion, I think Wikipedia is amongst all of the greatest innovations we've seen in recent human history. From the smartphone, Wikipedia is certainly one of it. Truly, I mean, the internet was designed for peer-to-peer sort of contributions and networks. So this open access concept was always there. And so by all means, I think Wikipedia is amazing. And we are not trying to be Wikipedia. It is truly has such a great critical mass and doing such great work. But at the same time, we're doing it a bit differently, because if you go to Wikipedia, again, it has such an amazing collection of content there. But again, their approach is more in the sense of an encyclopedia. It's really neutral. It's supposed to be neutral. So when you're reading something on Wikipedia, it's generally telling you in a very, well, supposedly a very factual way. This is this and this is this. The way we approach is a bit different, because we want to approach it from more an experiential standpoint. So we want people to actually contribute their experiences, their insights. So when you read our content, it's a bit different. The way it reads is actually a totally different sort of editorial scope. It's more or less as if you are almost directly listening to someone as they're writing something out. And of course, today with our podcast, you are also being able to do that as well. So the approach is entirely different. And we do think it brings something else to the table, because again, Wikipedia is doing such great work, but there's also, at least in my opinion, a lot of value also in learning from the experiences of others, not just in neutral facts that are being, created by Wikipedia.
That was very informative. Thank you, Mr. Melvin. So as a business student at Harvard University, could you share with us what was the driving force that shaped your entrepreneurial mindset?
So interesting thing is everything actually started, first of all, with a failure. It's almost cliche, but I think it's also oftentimes overlooked. Before everything, I actually saved up a fair bit of money. And eventually one day I was approached by a friend of mine in Hong Kong. And as the story always goes, he says, look, Melvin, I have a great business idea for you. We're going to launch a logistics business in Hong Kong. It's going to be amazing. Well, there was an issue there. So the issue was, first of all, I was not from Hong Kong, but I thought I was Asian. So I think that, at least by some category, is enough. My friend, who is from Hong Kong, but never grew up in Hong Kong. So in hindsight, that was a recipe for disaster. But again, as a person who's always quite meticulous, I thought, look, all I needed to do was to do some research, then certainly that would be enough. So I did a lot of research about the logistics market, as much as I could. And I read from a lot of the reputable sources, Nikkei Asia Review, The Economist, all these places I could get information on the market as much as I could. And I thought I was really confident that I could go in. And then finally, when we went in, and I invested a fair bit of my savings into practically all of it at the time. And within a year, it failed. And tragically, though I'm laughing now, tragically, I lost my money there. I even owed some money, actually. So it was quite disastrous. And I was absolutely shocked. And at the time, I was quite shattered. The feeling of actually going to do something and then having it totally fail is tragic, really. And what I realized was, in hindsight, I think what I needed to do was, if I could somehow talk to people in Hong Kong, like directly, and get their experiences rather than this macro overview that I got, I might have learned much more that could have saved me, maybe. And I had this idea that this was very important experiences. Now, my experiences of actually studying business, especially at Harvard, what they offered, which was quite interesting, was that, again, the focus isn't so much on just what you're learning from the textbook or the professor. There's also focus in universities like that, where it's about the exchange of experience between people. And hopefully a good business school or a good university has good types of people there who have a lot of experiences. So there's a value there. But there's also this sort of elitist feel where that is only restricted to, let's say, a school. What if a person can't go to that school for whatever reason? So eventually one, put two to two together. And then I realized that what if we were to actually do something about it, created maybe some sort of an avenue for people to directly exchange experiences, but in a more democratic way. Originally, it started as a print publication because at the time I had no idea how to go about it digitally. And what we did was we actually just went around asking people their experiences of doing business in Asia. And again, trying to prevent mistakes like mine, the tragedies like mine. And eventually that grew into a website, a platform, and eventually it grew from there. So all this really started from failure. And the one thing is I realized that there is a lot of value in experience and the exchange of experience, the exchange of insights. And ultimately, when you combine that together, what's that? That's actually personal knowledge. And there's something very valuable and also beautiful about it, yeah.
All right, Mr. Melvin, that was so inspirational to all of us here.
Thank you.
And moving on, Mr. Melvin, with the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic, many businesses globally have faced adverse consequences. However, digital companies in particular have witnessed a surge in web traffic. So how has it been the same trend at Empirics Asia? And also, in addition, how did Empirics Asia manage to raise a total of $8 million at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think one thing that's really certain with COVID, and I think not just for businesses, but for all of us, is that none of us predicted it. It very much is a type of black swan event, the idea of something that's totally unpredictable. And as many of us are thrown into it, if we recount and reflect back to the past 2 years, we feel a sense of kind of confusion. We feel lost. We don't know what to do next. There's a lack of direction. I mean, this thing is so novel in every sense of the word, from the personal level to the professional, and certainly for businesses too. And now more than ever, there is a great need for us to understand what's going on, a great need for information, or a great need for knowledge, and certainly a great need for the exchange of it. So in terms of actually growing a platform like this during the pandemic, at least from last year, because this year so far, we've only seen half a year, but at least from the past year, we actually saw a surge at the time with the Asian entrepreneurs traffic. And then obviously we rebranded in January. But so far we see great momentum still. And I think the reason why is because people, they still require, and especially now more than ever, they need a sense of direction of what to do next. I think for Empirics, there's great value there because now we are not just looking at business, we're also looking at more, wider context, even personal context. We've had psychologists contributing to us, writing about, psychological topics. And a very interesting thing is earlier this year, we actually developed and integrated an artificial intelligence into our entire platform, which analyzes trends. And surprisingly, one of the top trends is actually in psychology. And in a way, it's not surprising too, because again, I think most of us can relate. We were all stuck at home in one sense or another if you're locked down, and there's a need for that. Well, in terms of raising the funds, it wasn't that difficult, at least. And the reason why is because it didn't happen just within this context. It's actually over the past 2 years, we were seeking for funding to expand further. But ultimately what sealed the deal for us is because we have a bigger plan to actually go into a bigger area that is not really explored before. And that is actually publishing. And this is interesting because we are actually planning to publish books, not just what we're doing online. And a lot of people, when they think about that, at least when they first hear it, it's like, wait, isn't print dying? Isn't it a sunsetting industry? But of course, we have a different idea of it. We have a different opinion of it, and we want to explore that. And a lot of the funding is actually towards this new area for us. And besides the expansion itself. So to find investors that can understand it is what we ultimately managed to do. It wasn't difficult because we had lots of time to actually build our case for it, especially with some of the investors. And one of our investors is actually already at the moment a publishing group. So they totally understand where we're coming from in terms of our approach. And so we have that backing in that sense.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Melvin. As you briefly mentioned on artificial intelligence, your company recently launched the Empirics Asia podcast, known as the world's first knowledge podcast hosted and produced by artificial intelligence. Over the year, AI has certainly gained traction, yet the concept of having a podcast fully hosted by AI was not quite explored. In this regard, what were the challenges faced during the ideation process, and what was the public's response since the launch?
The way it came about was actually quite organic. So we were always interested in how we could leverage artificial intelligence because when you run a platform like ours, it is actually quite difficult. We receive a lot of submissions of content. And the challenge is finding what is actually valuable from a knowledge standpoint. That is actually very difficult because a lot of things that are being submitted, they could be frivolous, they could be commercially driven or have an agenda. And so we have to, a big part of our work is actually sorting through all this content and making sure that there is a degree of the control in chaos. And it is very consuming. So we always tried to explore the idea of actually using technology to help with the process. And eventually we invested and developed this artificial intelligence algorithm that would actually help us manage the process of actually finding good content and also help us understand our data better, because again, we are trying to provide more value to our readers. And very soon it came to this idea that since it was already doing all this, what if we were to go a step further and actually allow this robot, so-called robot, to actually even deliver the content? So we decided to actually explore that part. So the challenge was not really so much in the beginning part that I mentioned, the fundamentals of it, but in the delivery part was really where the challenge was, because we needed to, the idea of having a knowledge show where a robot, so-called robot, is trying to educate you humans is a very challenging idea. I don't know how many of you sitting here would want to listen to a robot, but it is challenging for a few reasons. First reason is there usually is an existential threat against the idea of an AI. We don't want to be replaced by robots. So there's this sense of aggression or fear. Then there's another idea of almost a discrimination, this idea that who would listen to a robot like that? Why would I listen to a robot? You know, there's this idea that we are better than them or something like that, this sense of fear. So the challenge was to deliver in a way where people would want to listen to it. So we explored around a lot, and ultimately we developed in this very naturalistic narration technology. And the reason why is because we realized that there would be a gap between getting people to accept listening to an artificial intelligence. So we spent a fair bit of time developing something that was more naturalistic. And how we did it was we did a lot of research. You know, we did a lot of research on what sorts of voices we should do, whether it should be a male or female, what sort of voice profile. Ultimately, we built an AI that was largely modeled after the actress Gemma Chan from Crazy Rich Asians, this British actress, who has an amazing voice. Not exactly the same, but modeled after. And again, to provide a very soothing experience, to help people overcome the fact that this is actually an artificial intelligence. Because if we can overlook that aspect, that sense of discrimination, there's a lot to offer here. Because again, what this AI is able to do is much more than what us humans can do. I myself, sometimes I actually do podcasts and I record certain videos where I share topics. And as a human doing it, there's a lot of limitations. I would have to sometimes take time to think, what is the topic I should talk about with, let's say, my audience? And this is largely really guesswork. Again, there's no way I can really analyze a lot of data. So it's a very basic human arithmetic, but this AI is analyzing it every minute, thousands of data sets. It's understanding it in an exponential way. And when I'm delivering something on the day itself, let's say even if I'm talking today, if let's say I'm not feeling well or I'm ill, my delivery might be bad, but this AI is doing it perfectly every single time. And it's also learning every single time. So theoretically speaking, but also practically, we're seeing it out with the public response. It is able to deliver knowledge in a very concise way that is very relevant based on the current data that we have. And so that is a very exciting thing for us. And that's what we think is really the value in this podcast.
Moving on towards the personal questions. So throughout the years of establishing Empirics Asia, what was the biggest challenges faced in developing the company? And how did you overcome these challenges?
I think the biggest challenge really was learning how to think outside your own ideas and your own expectations. Because when we first started 8 years ago now, it was a print publication. And again, my background was a background in law and business. So I had no understanding of computer science or technology or anything. So the way I thought of how we could do what I wanted to do, as I explained to you guys earlier, the idea of collecting all this information was in print. I'm an avid reader, so I thought this is the way to do it. And I never considered actually doing it in any other way. And so there was a sort of bias that was quite limiting in a way. And had I known there's actually this other path of doing it digitally earlier, then of course, maybe things would have moved even faster. But what I realized is to learn how to think outside of your own beliefs. And that was a very interesting thing. And the solution to that really is to make sure that you are working with a lot of good people who are encouraged to speak up and share their ideas. And you yourself as well, whether you are founder or person in the founding team, to be open to different ideas. That's often easier said than done, because naturally we are quite attached to our own beliefs and ideas. And through the years, many things that we did, that has been one thing I realized had been a challenge, and one that I realized it's important to overcome for people. And oftentimes, I think, even if you were to look at the history of business and entrepreneurship, many businesses, even the really big ones, they fail because they're unable to deviate from their own conventional paths. And that really is a thing. It's tied to our egos in a sense, which is quite natural and instinctive for us. The other challenge I would say as well is, I think this one is one that people should realize, is that it sounds quite cliche, but I think you're not always going to get the result that you want. And sometimes things can go, against your expectations, at least in terms of the outcome. And I think a lot of people, they too easily give up. That was one thing that has happened many times with us. And I think that the key thing that has set us apart from others is just that we've been really persistent. We've never really given in. And when we saw something that we didn't really like in terms of the outcome, we saw it as something that we should work on. So I realized that maybe entrepreneurship is quite an iterative process. Usually when you hear these stories in the media about entrepreneurs, it's always told in hindsight, in retrospect. So it sounds really smooth, but it was never like that. It's always been, at least in my experience, an iterative process. And I think thirdly, finally, the one thing I would share as well is, I think it's really important as well to realize, especially for yourself, what you're doing. And this is something people don't really think. Sometimes we think we have a really great idea, but maybe people don't really see the value in it, and you have to test your concepts and really see the worth of it, at least in the market. Even if it's something that's really innovative, that doesn't exist, you have to always test your own hypotheses. And that's also parts of the things we do, because we have actually launched other verticals too that have failed, actually. And so that is something that I've realized.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that all the challenges, and I'm sure all the persistency has paid off. All right. Having acquired prestigious nomination by the Forbes 30 Under 30, World Economics Forum's Young Global Leaders, Queen's Young Leaders Award, and Malaysia's Top 100 Young Entrepreneurs, how have these recognitions contributed to your personal and professional growth?
Well, it's certainly been quite interesting, especially for some of the ones you've mentioned, because for the longest time I've always been on quite a lonely journey, and also quite a rebellious journey. I think in the Asian mentality, I think especially for students or young people, a lot of our parents, they generally expect us to take a certain path, at least in their own times and their own historical cultural zeitgeist, at least in their times. These concepts of entrepreneurship and whatnot, it is quite novel to them. They don't understand it. I remember when I told my parents at the time, I said I wanted to be an entrepreneur rather than a barrister, which is what I was trained to do, and it was also my job for a period of time. They said, "What? You want to be unemployed?" I mean, that was their equation. Entrepreneurship means unemployment. And yet I decided to do that anyway. And having done that, at least for the past 8 years, for a large part of it, 90% of the time, there was no recognition. It was a very lonely journey. And every time when I went to, social gatherings with friends or whatever, or, professional networking events, I was always the really odd guy. Like, "Oh, what do you do?" And, again, it was always really strange because, again, there was no traction to what I did. And understandably so, because there was no traction. And so it was very lonely process for a very long time. And then when we started to actually get traction and recognition and personal recognition as well, that was a point where there was a sense of validation. And finally, I think there's a sense of at least feeling like I'm not that strange after all. And that's the interesting thing. And it's gone from being at one point where people were quite skeptical and also at the same time quite resistant and judgmental, to the point where people actually see you in a very admirable way. And I think that more than the award itself is actually more fulfilling and satisfying, just the sense that you've been through this hardship, you've been through this entire journey, and ultimately, this path was actually worth it in hindsight, proven to be at least a fulfilling path. And more than the award itself, at least for the past 8 years, this has been an amazing thing that has given a lot of purpose to my life, compared to, let's say, if I were working in an office in my previous job. So it really is a very beautiful thing, I think, truly.
Thank you, Mr. Melvin. As we are currently in the digital era, whereby technology is evolving at a rapid pace, as the founder of Empirics Asia, in your opinion, what is the future of digitally driven companies?
I think the future is really bright. I think a few things that we are working on, again, in no way to boast about it, because it really is a trend, but a lot of the things that represents our company will very much be incorporated in the future landscape of business, I think. First is the idea of what we're doing, which is crowdsourcing, the idea of peer-to-peer. We are seeing peer-to-peer in all sorts of manifestations. Recently, of course, we've seen it in very, very sort of hotly debated and discussed crypto world, where blockchain itself is very much a peer-to-peer concept. But the internet at the very beginning was designed as a peer-to-peer place of facilitator. If you were to read into the work of Sir Tim Berners, the original person that came up with the idea of the internet, his idea was, this is now finally a platform where people can collaborate, and more people collaborating in a collective way yields the most value than anything else. This is the thing that we are doing now with our platform. I see this as being integrated into all sorts of businesses. We're seeing it now in everything, even if you think about, for example, Grab in terms of transportation, in hotels, Airbnb, even social media in its essence is very peer-to-peer. So we are seeing more manifestations of this in every aspect of industries, and it's really exciting. So this is, again, only unique to digital world and only available in digital world. The other thing that I think will be quite important going forward as well is actually artificial intelligence. Whether we like to admit it or not deny it, but artificial intelligence is going to be incorporated furthermore into our lives and into our economies. It already is, actually. If you were to look at, again, all the industries, it is controlling our planes, controlling our financial markets in terms of algorithm trading, of course, media as well, and almost every aspect in our homes. And it's only going to get exponentially better. And in my perspective, rather than paint like a doomsday image of Terminator, Judgment Day, I see a bright future with artificial intelligence. People often talk about automation leading to job loss, but such people, I think they are slightly mistaken, because automation, at least if you were to study economics, does not lead to job loss per se. It actually leads to job creation in the industries that it creates and in the efficiencies it creates for the economies. But what it does do is it leads to job obsolescence. Some jobs will be obsolete, but statistically as a number, the amounts of jobs that are lost as compared to the ones that are created, at least throughout history that we've seen, has actually not manifested. So what I'm trying to say here is that artificial intelligence will be incorporated further. And because of this threat of obsolescence, which although is not statistically big, but can affect people personally, it's important for us to understand and embrace artificial intelligence, especially now, because there's no way that the genie has been let out of the lamp, and it's just going to really expand furthermore. So again, artificial intelligence will be a very big thing. But then finally, I think a very interesting thing will be just the growth of data. And again, generally speaking, the death of privacy. Again, data is going to be a massive field, as it already is. And now it's not only online, it's also moving to the offline. And again, we're seeing it collecting even our health data in terms of the fitness equipment, the trackers that we wear. And businesses will have to learn how to also integrate data, and they will. And it will help them technically serve markets better. But I think it also does bring some ethical and social questions about what that means for us individually. But the three major areas I see is these three things. The idea of more peer-to-peer and crowdsourced sort of based models, more integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and finally, more integration of data into businesses.
Oh, that was very insightful, Mr. Melvin. Thank you for that. So there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are constantly trying to find a problem to solve and potentially make business out of it. So as we are nearing the end of the interview, what advice would you give to these aspiring young entrepreneurs?
I think for people who are planning to start out being an entrepreneur and maybe have an idea, I think absolutely try and actually do it. But before you try, don't go in blindly. I think it's really important, at least from my experience, to gather as much information as you can. There are many, many failures, like my own, where a failure of it, which could have been avoided, really comes from building an understanding of what you're planning to do. A lot of people don't do that enough. I see a lot of people, again, in our past work at the Asian Entrepreneur, we have interviewed, I don't even know the exact number, but over hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs around Asia. And the common thing you see, especially with the ones that fail, are generally the people who are very naive that they have a great idea and it's going to work, but they've never really tested that hypothesis and certainly gathered the experience, at least from other people, about certain industries they're going into. And some of them are amazing products, but again, they have no market. So not even, just entrepreneurs in Asia, even if you think about big companies like Sunway in the United States, it's a famous story, a case study of a failure where the Sunway is designed to be a really amazing mobile transportation, platform, yet no one really wanted it. They thought it's going to revolutionize transportation. People use it on the streets, but again, we only see it being used by more cops, at least in the US. So same thing, I think, in Malaysia as well. There are a lot of businesses and entrepreneurs that fail because they have great ideas, but again, they have not tested it. And the other thing I would like to remind, as well as what I mentioned earlier, is that oftentimes when you see a result is not what you expected or what you desired, don't give up. Find ways to iterate to make it better. Because again, it's a sort of feedback that maybe what you had introduced was not the best. So, there's always open to all sorts of interpretations and modifications. And that's largely what we did as well at the Asian Entrepreneur. So, and now Empirics. So that's the other thing I say. And finally, I say, in terms of, again, what you guys mentioned about the journey and the recognition, a large part of it is psychological. You will feel this would be quite a lonely journey at times, and you will feel very doubtful of yourself. But again, what's at stake and maybe what's the greatest motivator is if you're truly passionate about what you do, I think that's reason enough, rather than pursuing something because people told you that's the thing you should do, or that will bring you happiness. Do what makes you happy, and ultimately what results from it, we don't really know, but at least in the experience itself, you might actually have something that's very memorable, and I think that's worth it.
Wow, Mr. Melvin, that was so motivating to try for success for all of us here. Yeah. So, all right, Mr. Melvin, this marks the end of our interview today. And on behalf of Sunway International Business Society, we would like to thank you and for your time and for sharing your experience with us today. It has truly been an interesting session, and we are sure all of us have learned new things from you. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to having you on board with us again in the future, Mr. Melvin.